So we are so excited that Dr. Karuba could be here with us tonight to talk to us about her research. Just to give you a little bit of background, Dr. Karuba is an associate professor of biology at the University of Ottawa. She has a PhD from the University of British Columbia and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Davis. She studies global change ecology and insect conservation. Her research examines the how and why species are responding to global change and what those responses mean for ecological communities, with a particular focus on plant-insect interactions. So now there's increasing evidence that non-native species can play a positive role in the persistence of native species and contribute to the achievement of conservation goals. So in her work, Dr. Karuba is investigating how and to what extent some native butterfly species utilize non-native plants as nectar sources. And if so, do they provide like a similar nectar benefit as native wildflowers? So tonight she's gonna share with us what her findings are showing and what this could mean for sustaining native pollinated populations. So very excited to see what how the evening progresses. And with that, I send it over to you, Dr. Karuba.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just get my slides. How does that look? Does that look okay? Yeah.
I think just need to try one more time.
I wonder if
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and there you go.
Okay, let's try.
Perfect.
See how the title slide, it looks okay.
It does.
Great. Okay, great. Well, okay, let's get started. Thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks for the invitation to talk to everybody. I feel especially humbled talking to you as an insect ecologist, that there's so many of you here, and also that when we talk about non-native plants, which I realize can be a divisive topic. And so I appreciate that you're coming out in terms of being curious and hopefully open-minded. And so definitely going to talk about it from my perspective and the research that we're doing, but I'm really curious to hear your feedback at the end of the talk. So we'll start with the sort of state of the issue. My slides will, oh yes, first Glenn acknowledgement from my perspective. So the university, which is where our physical lab space occurs, and most of our research is done around Ottawa, our field research, it occurs on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. So as we're all aware, there's a huge issue with introduced species worldwide. And so we live in a world of introduced species. We have European trees that live in Africa. We have African dung beetles in Australia. We have New Zealand snails in North America, and it goes on and on and on, right? In terms of the number and ubiquity, the scale of biological invasions is staggering, and it's not really any end in sight. So this is a figure now from 36 years ago, but it's showing you this time span from 1500 all the way to current day. And you can see the top, this is all species here, all non-native or introduced species. You can see that it's climbing, and there's not really any point of saturation yet. Again, it means that we're continuing to accumulate introduced species worldwide. And then it's broken down by different taxonomic groups. You can see maybe some of them are saturating a little bit, but for plants, we have still increases in plants worldwide and insects and other groups. There's huge proportions of communities that are non-native species. So for example, like on average, 35% of the plants in Hawaii are non-native. Introduced species are even bigger issues on islands. We have huge numbers of introduced species in different areas of the world. So that's sort of like where we're at right now. So we don't sort of expect to see any slowing down or certainly any stopping in terms of introduced species worldwide. before I get into my research, I wanted to stop and talk a little bit about terminology, because just to make sure we're all on the same page and thinking about where, at least in terms of how I define different concepts. So non-native species or introduced species or alien species, exotic species, all the same terminology. So these are species that are introduced by humans outside of their native range. So this could be species that are managed by humans, like agricultural crops. It could be species that are naturalized or otherwise occur without active human management. There's a subset of these non-native species that then establish self-perpetuating populations, and they're not dependent on human management to persist. So some subset of this global sort of number of introduced species that happen to occur in an area, then some smaller subset of those actually persist and stay in our environments. So basically that happens when abiotic and biotic barriers to survival are overcome, basically, and all these barriers, and they're able to persist. Now, not all introduced species become invasive. So even a smaller set of these naturalized species then sort of have this perception to be problematic in some way. And so they've either spread wildly, or they have negative economic impacts, they impact human health, or they have some sort of other negative impact on native species or ecosystems. So again, not all introduced species will become invasive. And it's some smaller fraction of the introduced species that, again, will end up with this sort of negative connotation, which we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the talk. So just to put it out there, and I'm specifically talking about, largely my focus of my talk is on non-native species. But because of this sort of issue, we've spent a lot of research and a lot of dollars thinking about all these potential negative impacts of non-native species. But we know a lot less about potential positive roles, which is basically the focus of my talk. We know even less about how what the role of non-native plants are like in plant pollinator communities, for example. So the community level, these sort of interactions are even less understood. A growing body of evidence suggests that non-native plant species are successfully integrating into plant pollinator networks. There's a few reasons why we think this is happening. So it's because a lot of non-native species typically have floral characteristics that make them attractive to resident pollinators. So for example, oftentimes, typically they have showy flowers, they have a large amount of floral rewards, for example. Second reason is they also tend to have highly generalized floral traits, which again, makes them attractive to a lot of different pollinator taxa. So they have flowers with radial symmetry, for example. And the third is that they actually share a lot of similar floral traits between native and non-native species. So again, the evidence is suggesting that there's a lot of introduced species that are non-introduced plants per se, that are getting integrated into native plant pollinator networks. This is an example here on the slide of pollinator sharing between an invasive, now in this case, I am saying invasive species, in coastal plant communities in the Yucatan. So this is an endemic native species on the left, and it shares up to 35% of its pollinators with this invasive plant species on the right. And so as you can see here, that there's high degree of floral trait symmetry between the two species. So in terms of their size and their color, the species are similar. And so that's probably why they're sharing a lot of similar pollinators between the two. So the focus of my lab, though, has been on thinking about non-native plants as nectar sources for native butterflies. And so this is potentially one of the positive roles that non-native plants could be providing, is this nectar provisioning. And so nectar is this essential resource for most butterflies, if not all at some point. So it provides water, sugar, amino acids. It provides energy for flight, and it oftentimes can affect a butterfly's lifespan and fecundity. So how many offsprings it has. So here's a few different examples of butterflies, both on native plants, non-native in the middle. So we don't really understand, again, how critical non-native plants are playing in the role, or in the diet of native butterflies, specifically their nectar diet. So that's a little bit of the background. And so I want to talk about 4 different projects or ideas through this talk. So the first one is talking about work we did on Vancouver Island with the native butterfly community there. And then secondly, similar questions, but around communities around Ottawa, Ontario, which is where I am now. And third, thinking more specifically about how do non-natives play a role in the diet of the monarch butterfly, which is as you know, is an endangered species. And then finally, and sort of concluding, thinking about, okay, well, taking a step back, how do we think about non-native plants in a climate change context? So if we put our climate change lens on, what kind of considerations do we need to think about? So the motivation for this work on Vancouver Island, which is the first project I'm talking about, was thinking about, okay, so when and how are non-native plants or nectar going to be used by native butterflies? And so we have really not done a lot of work on phenology, so the timing of floral availability. And so that's really where we thought this is going to be a key role for non-native plants or non-native nectar. And so nectar availability depends on flower and phenology. And so the theory behind it is that non-native plants are predicted to flower at different times of the year. So some of them are predicted to flower either earlier in the year or later in the year. And so they might provide these additional resources when native flowers are not available. And so in this case, actually, it's the opposite. I don't know why my coloring is in the I've colored it the opposite way. So non-natives here are in the middle of the season, whereas native flowers are early and late. Anyways, this is just a prediction of what we think could be happening. But we wanted to see, okay, could this be a reason why we might find some differences in how butterflies are using non-natives in a threatened ecosystem? So we did a survey in the Garry Oak ecosystem on Vancouver Island, which is found here. So this is a threatened ecosystem. It's heavily impacted by urbanization, has a lot of non-native plant introductions. Again, it's considered an at-risk ecosystem. We know that there's a lot of species at risk in this ecosystem. So there's, about 104 provincially at-risk species in this region. And so, and then also the Garry Oak ecosystem has now been reduced by 95% since when Europeans colonized. So very unique ecosystem, I would say, in Canada. And it just basically reaches its northern extent a little bit north of Victoria on Vancouver Island. So my students went out and surveyed these communities, these beautiful patches of Garry Oak ecosystem around Vancouver Island. They surveyed about 10 sites. And so what they did was they tracked the native butterflies in that community, tracked to see which flower species were the butterflies foraging on, and then also did full surveys of the plant communities in those ecosystems. So we found, overall, I'll say that we tracked 14 different native butterfly species, and we observed there were 81 species of flowering plants. Of all of these observations, we found a huge number of nectar foraging visits. So 83% of all the visits that the butterflies made were to non-native plants. So that's a huge number. Non-native plants, however, non-native plants only accounted for 30% of the total floral area. So non-native flowers accounted for less floral area, but they were still highly visited. This is the top 5 most visited plant species, and you can see that 1, 2, 3 are all non-natives, and we have 1 native here in the 4th place. But so most of the top visited plant species were non-native. So again, this is a huge proportion of butterfly visits that were to non-native plants. This is what it looks like through the season. So overall, we found that non-native plants were relatively more available later in the season. So here we go here. So you can see that at the beginning of the season, we have this high amount of native flowers or native nectar, primarily driven by common camas here, at the beginning of the butterfly season, I should say, so early May. And then the native species basically trail off, and non-native nectar is basically available through the year. It stays relatively constant. And so because of the drop in native plants or native flowering species, we end up with a relatively higher proportion of non-native flowers available later in the season. So this is now looking at how the butterflies tracked that seasonality. So basically, they followed that availability perfectly, basically. And so this is the proportion of visits to non-native flowers. So at the top, you have basically 100% of all visits were to non-native flowers, and at the bottom were native flowers. And so you can see this is the season again from early May to mid-August. You can see that through the year, or through the season, I should say, the increase in butterfly visits increased to non-native. So an increase. And by the end of the season here at the end, red line is. I think it was over 95% or 99% of all visits were to non-native plants. So it was the sole source of nectar by the end of the season here. And that was by July 18th in the Garryoke ecosystem here. So heavy visitation, especially later in the year. The other thing we were curious about in this ecosystem was, okay, you know, how are butterflies choosing their nectar sources? Is it strictly based on what's available? So if non-native species are more available, are they choosing them just based on availability? And so that's what we're looking at here. So on the x-axis now I have the proportion of non-native floral area that is available. So again, it ranges from 0 to 1 and from 0 to 1 in terms of the visits by the butterflies to the plants. And so if we expect butterflies to track perfectly what is available, that's what this red line is. So they should basically just follow along with when non-natives are more available, they'll just go to what's more available. And we can see here that this black line of this is what we actually observed, and it's actually higher than or greater than what you would expect just if they were tracking just the availability of flowers in general. So this leads us to conclude in this ecosystem that the visitation to non-natives was actually higher than we would have expected based only on availability. So that means that they're tracking something else about these species, and we actually don't know what it is yet because we didn't take enough data from this ecosystem yet to be able to say. But it's certainly curious, this pattern was certainly curious for us. So in this ecosystem, again, in the Vancouver Island, the Garryoke ecosystems, native butterflies foraged for nectar on non-native plants a lot. And some of them, we did have variation across butterfly species, but in general, it was really well integrated. In fact, the numbers that we found in this ecosystems were higher than other numbers that were found in the literature in other ecosystems. Native butterflies did track these seasonal shifts in flower availability, but there were times of the year where they actually selected non-native species more often than what we'd expected. So in this ecosystems, non-native plants are playing, from what we can see, a positive role in this ecosystem. And so we need to think carefully about how we manage non-native removal or control of non-native plants in this ecosystem. And so if you think about that later period of the year where non-native nectar was the only thing available, that's really where we need to think about replacing or adding native plants specifically at the end of the year when non-native nectar is the only thing that's available. We don't know whether we don't know whether we've lost native plants at the end of the year, like late season native plants, or whether we never had them and the non-native plants have extended the season because we don't have enough historical data. So that's a little bit of unknown in this system. So next, that work was done on Vancouver Island, and we were curious to know, okay, well, how general of this pattern is it? So, you know, do these patterns apply in butterfly communities around Ottawa? So again, we asked similar questions around the Ottawa area, and we focused specifically on the green belt. For those of you who don't know, it's this green patch of supposed to be more natural area around the sort of urban core of the city of Ottawa. And so we chose, again, similarly, we chose 10 sites in this green belt, and I would call them semi-urban sites with moderate disturbance. So, you know, there'd be footpaths through, so frequent human foot traffic, but they're not actually maintained really through disturbances like mowing, that sort of thing. You can see an example here. So some of the time they were rights of ways, some of the time there were more park areas, that kind of thing. Again, we wanted to see how much these butterflies around in the Ottawa area were using non-native flowers. So similar to the work that we did in the Garryoke, we did weekly surveys through the majority of the summer. We tracked again, the plants that the butterflies were using, and then also did independent surveys of what plants were available at those sites. And we looked at the availability of nectar from flowering forbs and shrubs in these areas. Because we also had interest in doing work on the monarch butterfly later on, all of these sites did have common milkweed, so they weren't totally a random subset. We wanted to make sure that milkweed was available at these sites. So this data, we're actually analyzed, like it's like sort of hot off the press. We're not quite finished analyzing it, but I was really curious for myself to start analyzing it and then share it with you. So we don't have everything figured out yet, and we don't quite know what the story is, but this is what we know so far. So this is similar data to what I showed with the Garry Oak ecosystem. So we had a slightly bigger number of butterfly species in this region. So we had 18 butterfly species versus the 14 that we found in Vancouver Island. We had 92 species of plants that were known to produce nectar in these sites. And so then we looked across the entire season of foraging made by butterflies. We had 63% of all the foraging visits were on non-native flowers. So this was slightly lower than what we had in the Garry Oak ecosystem, which was up at around 80%, but it's still greater than the majority. Here you can see the list of the 47 flowering species that were visited by butterflies in order of the frequency, basically number of foraging visits, and then they're shaded by native and non-native. So it's basically most visited to least visited. And so you can see here that the most visited species was Trifolium prantense, a non-native species. Common milkweed was a big one, but you can see this sort of mix, and a lot of the higher frequented species were again non-native species. The interesting thing that we found so far is that the pattern is different than it was in the Garry Oak ecosystem. So the seasonality is the opposite of what it was on Vancouver Island. So here we had non-native flowers were less available through the year. So it's the flip. So here later in the season, we have this peak or this increase in the native flowers that were available rather than a decrease like what we saw in the Garry Oak ecosystem. So if anything, the non-native plants are playing a bigger role at the start of the season here in Ottawa, around Ottawa, which is again opposite to what we had in the Garry Oak ecosystem. So that's super interesting. Here's another way of looking at it. So this is the same data, but now it's looking at the seasonality. So it's looking at, again, basically going from early in the season here to later in the season, and again, colored by gray and orange. So orange is non-native plants again, and gray is native. So you can see this huge concentration in the middle of the season with non-native species. And again, well, tails all the way in the early summer. And then you can see later in the season, we have this bigger concentration or increase in relative availability of non-native or a native species rather later in the season. So butterflies similarly did the same thing. So this is again looking at how the butterflies tracked that availability through time. And so here it's the flip of what we saw in the Garry Oak ecosystems. So the visitation to non-native nectar decreased later in the season. So they visit non-natives a lot earlier in the season, and then they trail off and start to visit native species more than they do non-natives. So again, we haven't sort of figured out exactly what's happening in this system. But again, non-native nectar is well integrated into these butterfly communities around Ottawa. And I would say the good news in a way is that these sort of semi-urban areas could actually be providing food resources to these pollinators, right? It means that these disturbed areas aren't totally disturbed in a way, and they still are playing a role in terms of food resources. So that's leading on the positive news story. Again, we found that non-native flowers are still providing nectar at key times in the year. And in this system, it tends to be earlier in the season. And so we think, based on some recent conversations I've just had with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, we think maybe some types of land use history around Ottawa, like logging and industrial agriculture, for some reason drove the decline of early season and midsummer native species in this region. And so that's why we have this sort of low level of native species early in the year, and then we have this higher abundance later in the year. So again, we need to think about, okay, what does this mean for restoration in these regions or in these sites and specifically? And so again, thinking about boosting native flowers earlier in the year rather than removing those early season non-native species might be a way to go. But the sort of key thing that we don't really know yet is, okay, so we have all these butterflies using nectar from non-native species frequently through the summer in these systems. We don't actually know whether they're providing good quality nectar. So clearly, again, in terms of quantity, we have high nectar availability from non-native plants. We don't know whether there are nectar quality differences between them. And so that's where the monarch butterfly comes in. So we really wanted to focus on the monarch to see, can we identify what high reward nectar plants are for the monarch butterfly? So just to get everybody on the same page, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the monarch, or at least the sort of updated status, conservation status. So the eastern migratory monarch butterfly has declined by more than 80% since we started monitoring its population in 1994. And so because of this huge decline over such a short period of time, the monarchs are currently listed as a species of special concern under Canada's Federal Endangered Act, so Species at Risk Act, or current federal legislation, sorry. And within a matter of months, we expect the government to sort of what we call uplisting the species to endangered. Scientists sort of disagree a little bit on, what exactly the main threat is, but we sort of lump them into three different categories, and they're all important in different ways. And so the key threats are loss of breeding habitat, migratory habitat, and the overwintering habitat. Declines in milkweed specifically, it's only host plant in the larval stage is the milkweed. And then finally, climate change. There's more evidence suggesting that climate change is impacting the monarch at some parts of its range. Of course, as you know, because it's a migratory species, the complexity of how these threats interact across its life cycle and across 3 different countries, it's quite complicated. But anyways, in order to conserve the species, each of these threats really needs to be tackled. And so we've been thinking about, okay, how do we approach or tackle habitat loss through habitat restoration? And so specifically, especially in Canada, we're thinking about prioritizing the migratory staging habitat, which is in southern Ontario. And so that consists of roost trees, which is where the monarchs rest between their bouts of migration, between the spring and fall migrations. And these habitats also include nectarine flowers that the monarchs will then use to fuel their migration in the fall back to Mexico. So we're thinking about, planting milkweed to increase its availability, but then also thinking about which nectar plants need to be available to provide high quality nectar for the monarch. So again, the goal is to restore breeding grounds and migratory staging habitat in order to improve the availability of both host plants, which is the milkweed, and then nectar sources as well. Interestingly, we don't have good data on which nectar plants we should actually use. So we don't have good data on what are the higher quality nectar sources for monarchs. So if we're going to go in and add a seed mix, well, which seeds should be in there, which ones are going to provide higher quality nectar. And again, we don't have a lot of data on whether or how much monarchs are using non-native plants. So should we be targeting them for removal? And so this will depend, of course, on how much monarchs are using them. So from the data that I just showed you from Ottawa, we went back and looked specifically at how the monarch butterfly was using non-natives, and it's similar to the general butterfly community. So on a bit more than average, or a bit more than half, so 58% of all the foraging visits of monarchs were on non-native flowers. And if you take out milkweed, which is its sole host or larval host plant, the number goes up to 81% of all foraging visits by monarchs in this region were to non-native flowers. So that's a lot of availability, or that's a lot of usage of non-native plants. This is what it looks like in terms of number of visits across different plant species, again, only by the monarch here. So similarly, we have 4 out of 5, the top most visited plants by the monarch, other than common milkweed, are non-native plants. So we set out to do an experiment, and we literally just wrapped up this experiment like last week. So I don't have any data to show you, but I wanted to show you how we're approaching it. So we took the data, we took our observations from around Ottawa and looked to see, we wanted to compare native plants and non-native plants in terms of how the monarchs performed in terms of nectar uptake by the monarchs. And so we did a field experiment. This is Carleton University in the back. So we did it in the field. We had a whole bunch of enclosures. We introduced the adult monarchs into these enclosures on different plant species. And then we tracked the weight of the monarchs over a 5-day period. And we looked to see what kind of weight gain the monarchs had over this time period. And then we're also going to do some body composition analyses later on. So based on what we found, so based on this Ottawa data, these are the plant species we used in the experiment. So we had a couple of native species. So we had the Canada goldenrod, evening primrose. We actually also have data on New England aster, which is not shown here. And then we had 3 non-natives. Again, these are the non-natives that were highly used, frequently visited by the monarchs in our survey data. And so we have the red clover, we have bull thistle, and we have perennial sow thistle. And so again, what we're doing is looking at how well did monarchs gain weight basically through the experiment. And so we're going to use that to tell us how much energy did they acquire from the nectar, and then how well will they be able to do through their fall migration going south. And so again, we're hoping to be able to use this data to help with habitat restoration projects, at least at the beginning around Ottawa, and then hopefully we can scale up in future years. And so again, the idea is that sustaining native butterfly or native pollinator populations, and again, reversing some of these declines in threatened pollinators, is going to require us to enhance and maintain habitats across many different land use types, which is why habitat restoration is so key. So ultimately, we want to be able to tell groups like the Canadian Wildlife Federation that does a lot of restoration work, these are the plants that are highly used in the region and that they are high reward for those species. And so that's what we're hoping our research would tell us. So I don't have that data yet, but hopefully we'll find out soon enough. So the last thing I want to do is just take a step back. So that was
plastic bag. A plastic bag. A black.
I'll just wait for it. So that was a pretty, I would say, sort of narrow focus, right? Really thinking about butterfly communities. But I want to, again, sort of take a step back and think about, okay, I haven't even talked about climate change. And so there's a lot of things we need to think about. Given our reality of non-native plants, how do we manage these systems in this context of climate change? So I wanted to point out some of the, I would say, key points that we need to consider in terms of, again, how are we going to manage these systems? So again, the sort of like base evidence, I would say not base, like a starting point is the fact that in some regions and some cities, again, non-native species already make up more than half of all the species we have and represent large fractions of the regional species pool. And again, non-native species are here to stay whether we like it or not, right? And we're seeing this continued increase of introduced species. I don't mean to be the bearer of the bad news, but that's our sort of reality. So what's happening right now is our modern ecological communities are basically in this flux. There's these species coming in, they're being introduced, species are moving out and shifting across the landscapes in response to climate change, right? We have species that are tracking warming temperatures, temperature extremes, all these things, which means that, again, our species compositions of communities are constantly shifting. There's some evidence now that's suggesting that non-native species, well, we actually know this, that non-native species can tolerate conditions that are associated with these modified landscapes that we spend a lot of time in better than native species, right? Non-native species are found where there's greater disturbance to begin with. The other thing where I'm saying, yeah, there's more and more evidence that's suggesting, and there's more work being done to show that non-native species might actually be responding more positively to climate change than native species. So native species might actually be a bit more sensitive. They might actually be less resilient in a way to climate change. Regardless, we know that climate change, again, across the board is affecting how species are responding, right? Climate change is occurring across the world and is affecting communities differently, but we already have a lot of evidence saying that species are tracking climate change, both in terms of shifting across the landscapes, in terms of their timing, a lot of different things. And then finally, there's more evidence, as I was saying here, that non-native species are providing new roles or similar roles to native species. So there is some evidence that non-native plants are maintaining ecosystem function in the way that climate change is happening. So here's an example here. So water scarcity due to climate change is leading to the decline of drought-sensitive native plants in, southwestern United States. And so again, we're losing drought-sensitive native plants. And so what's happening is that we're having this replacement of drought-tolerant non-native plants, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. So here's an example here where there's this introduced elm to North America that persists in these riparian areas that are now too dry for native species in these areas. At the same time, it has similar structural traits to populous species, native populous species, and there's some evidence that they're providing similar functional roles. So in terms of the way that they photosynthesize, in terms of providing wildlife habitat. So basically this is introduced elm is basically mitigating some of these trait shifts that we're seeing because of this shift in the drought sensitivity of species or species that can survive in these regions because of this increased drought that's happening because of climate change. So these non-native species in these places are potentially providing ecosystem resilience, the sort of stability in these ecosystems, in ecosystem function as climate changes, or at least until native species can kind of catch up. We don't have a lot of evidence and there's not a lot of examples yet, but there's starting to be increased evidence that this could be happening. So I just want to sort of end by saying, to just sort of like, which is all what you've done by coming here, is this to just sort of have an open mind and sort of rethink whether what role the non-native species could be playing in ecological communities. So I'll end by saying that I don't think it's as simple as saying, these species are good and these species are bad, these species are invasive and these species are not. It's going to be some sort of nuanced, right? Some sort of complex thing where a species could be invasive, but could be actually providing some measures of ecosystem function, like contributing biomass. Again, most species are probably causing a variety of impacts. Some of them might be beneficial and some of them might not. I'm certainly not arguing for planting non-native species. It's more to think about, if we have limited resources in terms of time, in terms of budgets, do we need to come through and clear out, remove all non-native species, or are there ways that we can prioritize which non-native species are removed and which ones are left? I'm imagining I'm going to get a lot of different questions on this, so I might just leave that for now, but just to say that it's just sort of to think about where we can be strategic and think about, are non-native species contributing in some way to ecosystem resilience, whether it's through pollination, whether it's through other sort of water regulation or ecosystem functions. I'll just end by saying that these are some of the co-authors, especially on the Ottawa area butterfly work. So we work a lot with Dr. Greg Mitchell, Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then these are some of the funding organizations that we get or funding grants from. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of field systems that have helped put the projects together. And I realize I spoke really fast, but that's probably great, as we'll have lots of time for questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight, Dr. Karuba. That was a fascinating and insightful presentation. I know there is a lot of conversation happening in the chat and a lot of questions in regards to what you've presented on today. So some of the answers you actually have, some of the questions that came in, you've actually answered throughout the course in terms of speaking to the quality of the nectar that these non-native plants are providing to the pollinators that are visiting them. But there is some more nuanced questions that are coming your way. And I think you talk to your stance that the purpose of this presentation is not to take a side on native versus non-native, but just to investigate. These plants are on the landscape, they're being used. What is the quality of the nectar that they're providing to the pollinators that are visiting them? And I think we'll get right into it. So let me go back to the beginning. Vancouver, based on your Vancouver Island study, are any of the native plants the butterflies visited butterfly pollinated? Would they suffer from lack of visitation? I'm not sure if I need to reword that.
No, that's a great question. That's a great question. Okay, so we didn't look at that directly, but I will say that in general, the role of butterflies as pollinators is sort of debated a little bit. So they're not they're not typically as efficient pollinators as bees. So they don't sort of have the role of like being as great of pollinators. I know there's more evidence from different systems like ecosystems now saying actually, you know, in some cases butterflies are playing a key role, and same with moths. I doubt it that in the Garryoke ecosystem that there are plant species that would only be pollinated by butterflies. I don't know that for sure. We didn't look at it, but that's what my sort of educated guess would be. That's a good question.
Great. In a related vein, might the exotic flowers have less or other pollinators on them, like honeybees? Perhaps the exotics have less competition present, so making them a viable option because no one else is really going towards them.
Yeah, that's totally the case. And I think that there was definitely like a big sort of data synthesis paper from a few years ago that looked at those sort of indirect effects. Yeah, so like is there competition happening around non-native plants? And I don't think so far we have evidence to say that at least there's no sort of interference happening. Anyways, but it could be the case. Generally, we don't have a lot of competition for nectar among adult butterflies. It could be different for bees anyways, but it's an interesting point for sure.
I think there will be a lot of interesting questions that come out of tonight's talk.
Yeah, no,
We do have
I'm gonna get my notebook. Yeah.
we do have a question direct from the audience member Sylvan Ashbrook. I'm going to ask you to unmute, and if you still have your question, you feel free to speak now.
Thank you. I appreciate it. By the way, this is a wonderful presentation, and I've been looking forward to it all day. So thanks
Oh,
for
good.
presenting on this.
Great.
So I've been doing a lot of work with like microhabitats as part of like a conservation strategy. I noticed in your talk that a lot of the focus was emphasizing like larger properties and like large scale ecological restoration. I guess my question is, do you um, think that like microhabitats across a wider like geographical area will play a major role in butterfly conservation or just pollinator conservation in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think a little bit, I've been starting to think more about microclimates, but it's similar to microhabitats, which we didn't consider in our systems. From other ecosystems, I think there's sort of mixed evidence. Yeah, like in terms of other types of plants, whether, you know, non-natives can provide sort of like a nurse plant type of buffering effect. And so it's, I guess, sort of mixed evidence. I think it would, for the butterflies, I think that would come down to whether like shrubs and trees, you know, the degree that non-native shrubs or non-native trees were providing nectar, because that's where you would get bigger sort of microclimate, which is I think maybe what you're, a little bit of microhabitat there. I think that's where you'd get a bigger role of the non-native plants. I think generally the sort of herbaceous plants and the open meadows, I don't think would have as much of a role. You might have a different effect if you looked at like the larval stage of butterflies, which are, you know, they hang out in lower level of foliage, but I don't know how much of a role it would play.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, it could be different, again, it could be different types of systems, like agricultural landscapes could be a bigger role. Again, we didn't we were in urban systems primarily. So agricultural could be a bigger issue, because I know that's where a lot of microhabitat, microclimate work is being done along field margins and that kind of thing. So it could be a bigger role there too.
It sounds like there's a lot of opportunities for continued research to get at some of these deeper questions. Another question coming your way was, what's the percentage of sites that were comprised of native, non-native, and mixed? Like, are the growing conditions or needs for the native and the non-natives the same? So are there differences in soil composition that might be factoring in to the prevalence of one versus the other, perhaps?
That's an excellent question. So because this was basically like our first, I would say, sort of first pass through, first surveys through, we wanted to kind of control, we wanted to control for as many other site characteristics that could affect exactly what you're saying. So we really wanted to focus on keeping sites as similar as possible, both in Ottawa and both on Vancouver Island. So we also really tried to focus on, and again, we were really interested coming in on this phenology question, the seasonality. And so we also tried to limit the variation across sites in terms of how much of the community was non-native. So like on Vancouver Island, our sites probably varied from 40% non-native to maybe 60% non-native. So we didn't have any truly pristine sites, and we didn't have any like 100% non-natives. We had these, we really tried to get this mix of non-native and native so we could have a better understanding of that interplay between native and non-native. But, and the same thing in Ottawa, very similar setup in Ottawa, but that's a really interesting question. And I've had that question before. And I think the sort of landscape, both site level characteristics like soil, disturbance level, and then surrounding landscape factors are really interesting. And so I'd like to scale our work up to be able to do a bigger gradient that we have been able to do. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to do next, actually. So great question.
I think I'm going to read this question, but I do think you answered it somewhat throughout your presentation, but you may want to add to this. Each study, what is the percentage of the expected native pollinator plants available? Could it be the natives are just so rare that the non-natives were selected? Insects, do what they have to do to survive.
Well, I mean, I guess we tried to account for that as much as we could. So we accounted for how much floral area was available with native and non-natives. We have not oh yeah, somebody asked us this question. Somebody asked us this question when we were in the peer review process for the Gary Oak one. We haven't done it for Ottawa. And we took out the rarest of the plant species to see if that affected anything. We had very few of our plants, really rare, and it didn't change anything. So we have done some tests to see whether, like you said, the natives are so rare that they're just not being found. But I don't think that's what's driving it. Again, that being said, we didn't really get into plant species specific level questions because again, we were doing this sort of community level. So that could again be a question for future research directions, focusing on specific plant species to see how their availability affects their pollinator visitation and that kind of thing. That's another question that I think would be interesting to ask next.
Right. Do you know if the native butterflies are getting adequate nutrition from the non-native plants, or is it just like having cravings or junk food? So again, you touched on this in recap, and it looks like you're kind of in the early stages of mining that data to determine how much benefit a target species is getting from a native versus non-native plant. But do you, at early stages, do you have any inclination of which direction the data would skew towards?
I don't I don't know. So we have in the Gary Oak ecosystem, we definitely had I think maybe it was like two threatened butterfly species, considered to be on the BC list of threatened species that were using non-natives. We don't have good numbers. We don't have good data on, populations of these butterflies in these communities. So we actually don't know, whether there's huge decreases in these species. I think, I think if there was a massive decline, we would know, like, again, these threatened species. So it's really hard to say. It's really hard to say. I think, I don't know. I don't know. I think that the other thing that I don't know what to say. I was going to say the other thing that we were wondering about, and we tried to take some measurements this summer, was if the non-natives have lower quality of nectar, are the butterflies compensating by spending more time nectaring, or, are there other compensations that they're doing, which could be happening? I guess my gut is I don't think they're going to be hugely different in native species, but I don't know. So we don't know. But there's a few things at play that happen.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating area. I think there's more research to come and to more answers to come that will delve at some of these questions. This is getting
one thing that I
question.
just to interrupt, I just remembered. So one thing that I didn't stress in the Gary Oak study was that, our study, the studies we did were only in the patches of these Gary Oaks. And so I don't know, for those of you who've been there, you have these really isolated habitat patches, and they're surrounded by, like, in some areas, they're completely surrounded by, suburban housing. There's a lot of urban gardens. So we actually probably are underestimating how much non-native plants are feeding these butterflies, because these butterflies can easily just fly out of these Gary Oak ecosystem patches and visit these urban gardens around Victoria, which for sure have non-native plants in their gardens, like ornamentals. So if anything, just to add, we state in our paper that we're likely highly underestimating, the non-native nectar in these diets of the butterflies. Just to say it, I forgot to say that before.
Thank you for clarifying that. Are these non-native cultivars or simply natives from outside the area? Like, I guess it's touching on boundaries, borders.
Yeah. So, the ones in BC, I'm trying to think of, I think they might have been at the North American level in terms of whether they were considered native or not. We have a species, or echinacea species in Ottawa that is, like, not native to Ontario, but it is in Canada. So anyways, we're sort of grappling with that ourselves. I think we will do a few different tests to see, if you define them differently, do we get the similar results once we get through the analysis of especially of the nectar quality one?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that lovely segue. Has there been any analysis regarding the chemical composition of native versus non-native nectar?
So, again, we're sort of taking a first pass. So yes and no. So we're using the weight gain of the butterflies, the monarchs, specifically to tell us what the quality of the nectar is. That was our sort of first pass through, and we tried to also take measurements of the sucrose and water content of the nectar of some of these species. We weren't super successful because some of them are so small, but we're hoping to get at least a few of the species so that we can sort of compare the direct measurements of sugar to how the monarchs gained weight, and to see, how standardized that was, and see whether we can make extrapolations or generalizations to other species from the ones that we've looked at. So we just finished the field experiment. We did our best to take nectar quality measurements directly, and we'll see how we do with those when that analysis comes through.
Yeah, thank you. Because nectar is shared among species, could it be that the non-native species have more nectar availability, similar to fast food always available for any species?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure I get it, but again, some of the evidence in other systems suggests that typically, these non-native flowers have more nectar available. So I don't know sort of like what the uptake is pollinators, because nectar producing is sort of like this plastic thing that's sort of continuous. So I would say, I think, yeah, there's evidence that non-native plants have higher nectar quantity available. So that is probably feeding into it as well. And there's also like the floral traits, which we haven't had a chance to look at either.
Yeah.
These are
And
excellent questions.
yes, you are getting a wealth of
Wow.
excellent
No, but
questions.
these are great. Yeah, very thought-provoking.
What about food sources for other stages of the butterfly's life cycle? Would increasing the supply of non-native plants as a nectar source reduce the larval food sources?
Potentially, yeah. I don't think I haven't seen like a convincing case, at least in these systems, to increase non-natives. It's more of to keep what we have and not take them out. We haven't done any studies like in my lab on yeah, like the larval diet, and some of these butterfly species are specialists at the larval stage on native host plants. And so I don't know what the interaction would be. Again, I don't think that not arguing necessarily for an increase in non-natives, but just to keep some of them at least until we can get up supplement more native plants, at least early or late in the year, depending on which system. There was evidence from other areas like in California and even in BC where native butterflies, the caterpillars will feed on non-native plants, and there's like sort of a lot of flexibility in the more so than we've ever thought in terms of the diet of caterpillars. I just don't know for sure, like in terms of that interplay in these systems, yeah, but that's also super interesting.
Yeah, the whole area is very interesting. Have you studied the percentage of visits of monarchs to other types of milkweed? Like, generally focusing on the common milkweed, but like swamp milkweed or butterfly milkweed. Have you included that and you just didn't come up in the figures? Or is it not one of the top species?
Well, so in Ottawa, around Ottawa, it really is common milkweed. And again, we were sort of selective in the sites that we did survey. I don't have all I don't even know. Yeah, the other milkweed species were real, like, I don't think it even shows up here. And I think it's partly just the type of sites that we have. So it's not that they don't visit the other milkweed species, it's just that in these sites, they tend to be drier sites, so we didn't have a lot of swamp milkweed. Yeah, so in the Ottawa area more generally, I'm sure they're using them. It's just that not at these sites they're highly used. But again, our focus really was on common milkweed.
Yeah,
so common here. So yeah,
this one's a very interesting question. What about the biomass? Could it be because even though they are using non-native nectar, but their survivability is not less? So this is coming to us from Olga. So Olga, if you're still on the call, you can unmute yourself and maybe elaborate on this question. How I'm interpreting it is just wondering if
Yeah,
the butterflies are surviving.
Yeah, basically, yeah, because like we know how much biomass of all insects reduced in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I was wondering if we see them, could it be connected in part to, of course, losing, all the reasons, plus also recent reason was a lot of talk about air pollution and insects not recognizing smells as well. But could it be that, I guess, yeah, quality of the nectar or not supporting reproduction the same way or what's not? I guess it's kind of you kind of were answering it because it was asked different way, the question.
and so your question is whether it could be linked to the declines in insect biomass, like in general.
Could it be one of the reasons?
Yeah, it hasn't been pointed towards it as evidence, like tying them together. I don't think it will be, but there hasn't been a lot of evidence. I think the other factors are probably a bigger problem, like habitat loss, other aspects of pollution, climate change.
Uh,
So
can I
my
just
sense is no, and I don't think there's any evidence
ask
either.
a question? Should it be some kind of golden ratio of host plant versus nectar plant? You know, like is it even possible to calculate or get some idea about it?
It's to get, can you just restate that question?
Sorry. Is there some golden ratio for host plants amount versus nectar plants amount? Let's say if butterflies would actually thrive more on non-native plants, generally speaking, but like yet they would still, many of them would need very specific host plants. What would be the composition of this for butterfly to, thrive for a butterfly?
Yeah, I mean, we have no idea at that level of resolution. I will say though that different butterfly species, like in terms of where they get their energy across the life cycle. So for some species, the energy they gain as caterpillars has a more of an impact on the survivability and the reproduction of the butterflies than the adult stage. And then some other species, the adult stage is a lot more important. So that could come into play of what you're saying, but we don't know anything about, what the sort of best standard would be for composition of diet across the board. It's going to be interesting. There's so many questions. I mean, again, like in terms of what we hope to measure from the nectar, and then again from the monarchs, we're hoping to get, again, weight gain or weight loss because it was an experiment, and then fat content, and then like water. But there's so many different metrics, right? And that's only one aspect of their life.
Also,
but
when you were weighing monarch butterflies, was it for monarchs that you were taken care of, or it was wild caught monarchs? Like how?
We caught monarchs, maybe a handful of monarchs around Ottawa, and then we mated them and reared them from their eggs, like they were in captivity. And then we used those for an experiment, but we also released a whole bunch because we didn't need as many. So we probably released like 100. So we took maybe 5 and like released 100. So
the latest research saying that monarch butterflies that were reared by human actually have much smaller survivability. It was just like came out this year, and they say that basically they weigh less and they don't survive as well as the ones that are naturally, like it was like this year. Like if you didn't see it yet, like look into it. It was like a study that basically saying that doing it, by human, it's probably not as beneficial to the probably because survival of the most adaptable, the fittest, whatever. Maybe because like when humans do it, even the weak butterflies survive, but then once they're released, don't survive right away.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely balance. I would say, the conservation status of the monarchs in terms of how we rear them and whether we release them, which ones we release, and then what we're doing in terms of a scientific study, and try to be really careful in terms of like mixing of the populations and that kind of thing. There's a lot of different, as you say, like updates on the sort of science in terms of how to rear them, and we do our best job to have natural conditions anyways.
So much, thank you. It was a great presentation, like more questions than answers, but it's a great start.
Yeah, I know.
That's a good research when it creates more questions to research. There's still so many more questions that are flooding in here. I'm going to try and skip through the ones that have a theme. Are there any data that are most visited? Is there any data on most visited plant families, and comparing them to native versus non-native? Was that clear? Maybe I need to say it again.
No. We haven't done a lot of work on, I would say the phylogeny of the plant families in either place like Ottawa or Vancouver Island. So I don't know. I'm trying to remember the composition or the family differences between them. I don't know. And we had started to look at like floral traits, colors, what were the colors in the non-natives and the shapes and all this, but we didn't finish it. It was too much to put in one paper, and then my PhD student finished. So we had, I don't know, to answer your question. And we didn't get through all the data that I'd wanted to. So that's why I can't answer that, unfortunately. But,
It's very early in the process. We understand that for sure.
well, but then the students are off, so it's hard. But that's also really interesting. It's how the evolutionary history of, or relatedness of natives and non-natives in these systems.
So I guess this next statement / question maybe is getting at the restoration side of things. So lack of native floral resources early in the season suggests that maybe we need to concentrate more effort into planting early flowering native species. But is that more for native bees, like willows and cherries? On the other hand, how many butterfly species are present early in the season, necessitating lots of resources, like red albemarle, morning clove, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, actually, we for the Ottawa study, we only started our surveys in early June, so we actually missed some of the early season native butterflies around Ottawa. I guess it depends on what the priority is for the restoration, right? So yeah, I don't think there's a huge number of early, this is why partly why we started in June, because there aren't a lot of early season butterfly species around Ottawa. And so bees might be a better, something else to focus on early season. I think it comes down to the goals of the restoration project in question. And then, what do you want to prioritize in terms of insect communities, pollinators, that kind of thing?
Give you a little mini break from questions, just to make a little statement from one of the audience members. I appreciate the emphasis on prioritizing goals on habitat restoration, invasive removal to maximize impact on pollinators. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking presentation.
Awesome.
All right, back to the grilling. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it's great.
In a garden context, in lieu of wood chip mulch, would a green mulch of red clover be a beneficial non-native companion to otherwise primarily native plant gardens from a butterfly's perspective?
Yeah, red clover is okay. From based on frequency of visitation, red clover seems to be great. Happily visited by lots of butterfly species. And soon we will have some evidence about what kind of nectar quality they have.
I think the research coming out of that is going to be very insightful. To what degree will near natives from south of us play into your future research as climate change continues to factor into your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely on my radar. And same with local adaptation of these plant species. We have a joint, so yes and no. I don't have any like immediate plans, but we had a joint experiment running that looked at how warming is affecting nectar quality. And I wasn't able to cross it with non-native species, but something else to think about. It's certainly on my radar because that's the other sort of part of my research program, is that we think about how species are tracking climate change across the landscape. So that would be really interesting to do, for sure.
Another comment from the audience is so much nuance to your work, Heather, and how you frame it. And with regards to the central questions, nectar quality not just vegetation remaining. Thank you for your fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Next question for you is I'm curious about the observed differences between early season use of non-native plants between Vancouver Island and Ottawa. Has there been any attention paid to the role of the very different climates? Spring comes much earlier after a less severe winter in Victoria versus Ottawa, for example.
Yeah, so the type of climate, yeah, it's a huge difference. So we know in the Garry Oak ecosystem that drought in the summer is really important, and that's really what drives the end of the season for butterflies and a lot of the plant community in the Garry Oak ecosystem. So, yeah, increasing drought through July and August, and so the season in the butterflies ends a lot earlier again on Vancouver Island than here. So drought is, I think, what's driving what's happening at the end of the season. And so we think again that we have drought tolerant non-natives that are doing fine at the end of the season, and that's the nectar that the butterflies are using. Again, we don't know whether native species historically were there at the end of the season and now they're not. And non-natives came in and pushed them out, or whether non-natives are extending the season, because we don't have any data on the timing of butterfly seasons many decades ago. In Ottawa, obviously the dynamics are different. And so I think it seemed, again, from like just recent conversations that I've had, and I'm going to look into it, is that we are losing native species at the start of the season in Ottawa. I don't know why, and I've already asked this question of my colleagues, why would specific land uses like agriculture and logging have targeted earlier season natives and not later seasons? I don't know that yet. I don't know whether it's just an abundance thing. I don't know yet. So I don't know. From what we do know, climate seems to be what's driving the changes in the Garry Oak from the data that we have. Whereas Ottawa, I'm wondering if it's more land use history, but we don't know. We don't know like one or the other.
Similar stream, does nectar quality, and again, you may not have the answers to this yet because your research is just underway. Does nectar quality depend on soil structure and microbiological diversity?
Yes. Nectar quality depends on like so many things. Yep. The short answer is yes, it does. It was a challenge to figure out how, and I don't know what's gonna happen with our data, because it was a challenge to make sure that we were standardizing our measurements enough that we could control for all the things that could affect it. It's like time of day, how much rain there had been, how warm it is, how many pollinators had come through. So a lot of different things affect nectar quality. And so we're gonna try and do the best we can to sort out what we found this summer.
Excellent. Another comment in the chat is that this was a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for the new perspective. And one audience member is saying, does it basically boil down to limiting invasive species which form monocultures, dramatically reducing biodiversity? In terms of, I would assume, restoration management strategies coming out of this.
Yeah, I mean, that would, yeah, maybe, hopefully. I mean, simple is always really nice, and hopefully that'll be the case. Hopefully that'll be the case. I don't have any, that's not true. We did have some, we did have an invasive plant that showed up as providing nectar, but I think that the negative impacts of something like dog strangling vine in Ontario are so great that they outweigh the nectar benefits of, or the nectar provisions that something like dog strangling vine is doing. So hopefully it's as simple as focusing on the most invasive species and getting them out.
This next question is kind of fun. If you had all the funding in the world, what sort of study would you undertake? To get at some of your questions.
I think what would be, and again, I like, this is pure science. Scientist is like to do an experiment, like a large scale habitat restoration experiment where either we remove non-natives from different plots or we add them in and then look at how restoration or how the plant community and pollinator community is restored over many years and across many landscapes. That's something I would think would be fantastic. I mean, it's probably a little bit narrow-minded if you're telling me I have lots and lots of money, but that's what I know that will cost a lot of money from the work that I do. I know that's a giant leap in terms of how much funding I would need to do that. So because it takes a lot of hours to do the surveys and to do experiments, field experiments. So that's something that I think would be really useful to test, to know for sure, you know, if you remove non-natives, this is the impact it has. And versus leaving them in the community, this is what it, you know, I like to sort of isolate all these different effects.
Excellent. And next questions, I think you could elaborate. How do you weigh a butterfly?
How do you weigh a butterfly?
Yeah.
You have a really precise scale. And so we would keep them in their, I don't think I have a picture of it, like a small container and put it on the scale. Like we weigh the container before without a butterfly, have the container go in with the butterfly, and then like compare it with and without the butterfly in the container. And actually they're pretty tolerant of, you know, being taken out of these enclosures here and then being brought in. It's, you know, usually in a cooler environment, so they're not as active inside where we weigh them.
Thank you. And another statement from the audience, again, helping with overall perspective. I think human facilitated introduction of non-native plants has increased the need to discuss this and study it. It's fascinating to see how insects are adapting to a massive change in ecological communities and the impacts from climate change. So
Awesome.
I'm going through to see if there are any pressing questions. Are there any plans to extend this study throughout their migratory routes?
I mean, yeah, that'd be great. In theory, yeah, it'd be worth, I mean, there's so many, the funny thing about the monarch, well, the funny thing, but you know, because there's just so many other insect species, but there are a lot of people working on the monarchs. So it could, you know, in theory, it would be easier to collaborate, you know, across the US and do this again in more southern United States, for example, where it'd be really interesting to do it. I don't have any immediate plans, but the work isn't published, so you never know, right? And we'll see where it takes us. I think it'd be really interesting to do. I'm leaving I decided I should put back the acknowledgement slide because my email's there if people have follow-up questions or want to get in touch or
Thank you for
want to
that.
help me
That's
do this
amazing.
work.
I know we have 5 minutes left, so it's just a few questions. I think we've got through the majority of them. There's a lot of interesting commentary in the chat itself, but could it be that butterflies have evolved more quickly to take advantage of non-native nectar sources, especially in early spring in Ottawa, given that climate change has made spring earlier than historically by at least a couple of weeks or more?
Okay, so I would say in a general way, insects are thought to be able to have the potential to adapt faster because they have more generations, or often have more generations than obviously perennial species and longer lasting or longer living plant species. So there's that potential there for adaptation to occur more quickly in insect species. We don't have the sort of adaptation question with climate change is a tricky one, and we don't have good data on it. So it's been really hard for scientists to separate whether the responses that we've seen in terms of, earlier flight seasons and that kind of thing in butterflies and other insects, it's just a question of like innate flexibility. So they already had this built-in responsiveness or flexibility to change the timing of their seasons in response to climate change. There's as always, there's increasing evidence of adaptation occurring in different populations and systems. It's just been harder to tease apart how much of it, again, is sort of like ingrained flexibility versus specifically genetic adaptation. I would say in regions like Ottawa, where we have where it's really temperate season, we have a lot of seasonality, we have pretty extreme sort of, switches from winter to spring. My suspicion, and I think, it's supported in the evidence and the literature, of the fact that insects and plants have to be really highly adapted to having an early spring, having a late spring, having a late frost, that the sort of interannual variation that we have in terms of when winter stops and when spring happens and that kind of thing. So my sense is there's a lot of plasticity, a lot of flexibility in the species that live in these regions. And so we just don't know at sort of what point that they are going to hit their threshold, and whether and when genetic adaptation will be needed and will have happened. So it could be occurring at the same time. We just have a really hard time of teasing the two things apart. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Dr. Karuba. People are very interested in getting the results or following up with you on the results of your studies. So thank you for putting up that slide here. And final, I'll have room for maybe 2 more questions. What change in land management do you hope will come from your data?
I like, in a perfect world, I would say for efforts for a lot of the restoration work where, again, there's limited budgets and people have to go through for, all the reasons and constraints, which I totally appreciate, where they have to go through and clear a plot of land to the extent that they can leave some non-native species there and be selective in which ones are removed, kind of like what we do now with forestry or logging. I hope that we consider that. And I think the other thing that we do a lot of is like widespread mowing in terms of like roadsides, parkland, and that kind of thing. And so mowing, sort of just takes down potentially all these nectar plants that could be actually being useful. So I think thinking about when we are mowing in the year, so like postponing if we can to be later in the year, later in the season. Like in Ottawa, they went through at the end of August, early September, when monarchs are still migrating. Anyways, and then thinking about how much we're mowing, like how much of our landscapes do we actually need to mow? I think those would be like 2 big things that I would like to see some changes on.
Thank you. That was amazing. And we've come to the end. There are a few more questions. And I think the email that you've posted in this series can be used to maybe forward some of those questions to you, if that's okay, Dr. Karuba.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I think I speak on behalf of all of NAMPS and the membership here tonight. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for taking this evening to go through your research and give us the insights on what you're finding. It's a very informative discussion that you provided us tonight. And I think I will maybe end on one final statement from the audience members for you that may give you a little joy. This has been a really fascinating talk. So many research paths available to chase. I agree with the other comments that you might need to clone yourself.
That I might need to clone. Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's really fun for me to talk to an audience that's so invested and interested. Like, I don't usually get questions like this. This has been so amazing to see. So it's been great to be able to talk. And hopefully, I can come back next year with results.
We did have one question in terms, do you know when your results are actually going to be available? When are you hoping to have them analyzed by?
So science can be a bit slow. I'm hoping to have the nectar quality analysis done by the spring, because I have an honors student that needs to graduate by then. And then it has to go through the peer review process. So it could be another couple of years, but I could still speak to it, whether or not it's finalized, in another year for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time this
Thank you.
evening. It's been amazing. It's been thought-provoking. And again, to everyone that took time out of their schedules to come and join us, thank you so much. We will keep you updated on this recording and when it becomes available on the website for viewing for all of those that didn't get a chance to attend tonight or just wish to rewatch this. And from all of us here on NAMPS, have a wonderful evening and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Be safe.